Hello everyone, this is Dr. Pooja Sharma, Assistant Professor, Department of Management, the Bhopal School of Social Sciences. Today I'll be sharing with you thoughts on a very engrossing topic, barriers to communication, from Unit 4 of the subject Business Organization and Communication. Let us take a quick look at the learning objectives of this module. We will commence with communication, communication process, the types of barriers to communication, the definition of barriers to communication, and how to overcome these communication barriers. First of all, what is communication? There are four essential elements: sender, the message, the receiver, that is you, and the feedback, which is your response. The next we need to understand is the communication process. The sender is sending the messages to the receiver. The sender is encoding that message which the receiver is receiving through a certain channel and then decoding that particular message. After decoding, which means understanding or grasping that message, he is quickly giving a feedback. Feedback could be even just that, yes, a nod from your side that you've understood what I'm trying to say. It could be non-verbal, it could be a verbal communication. Now, let us try to understand what is effective communication. We have been using this word quite often. When the transmission of the message reaches the receiver as per the sender's expectation, it is called as effective communication. We now begin with the topic barriers to communication. No matter how good the communication system in an organization is, barriers can and do often occur. These barriers are those which make the message doubtful for the reader to understand. They get confused, or they might not be able to interpret that particular message. So, barriers are the factors which influence the clarity, the accuracy, as well as the effectiveness of the message by acting upon any or all of these basic elements of the communication process. We need to recognize these barriers. So, the first step to improve our communication style is to remove these barriers to communication. A prudent manager in an organization must be aware of these barriers and must try to minimize their influence in the day-to-day operations of an enterprise. Broadly discussing, there are various barriers, like it could be time, distractions, put downs, too many questions, other people, physical distance, there could be noise. So, let us try to classify these barriers into specific heads. There could be physical barriers, there could be semantic barriers, there could be organizational barriers, emotional barriers, perceptual barriers, cultural barriers, gender barriers, and the list is endless. But today we'll be discussing and we'll be pondering on the 5 main barriers of communication, which are the physical barriers, language barriers, organizational barriers, the psychological barriers, and the last one, that is personal barriers. To start with, we'll first go ahead with the physical barriers. These are the barriers which can be expressed in physical or measurable terms. It can be in the form of noise. Physical barriers are communication interferences that occur in the environment around us, wherever the communication is taking place. It means interference that occurs in a process which blocks the receiver to receive that particular message which is being sent by the sender to a degree of perfection. So, the noise can be of 4 different types. It could be physical noise, some outside disturbance, psychological noise, inattentiveness, you're not paying attention to what I'm saying. So, that is also one type of a noise. The third is written noise. You've sent me something, I've got a communication from my top management, it's handwritten, and that writing is not at all legible. The fourth noise could be visual noise. There is a conference going on, there is a meeting being conducted in the organization, and there are so many latecomers, like you must have seen in your classrooms. The students who come late create a noise, create a disturbance. So this also forms a major barrier to communication. Next one is improper time. Improper time of communication also hinders the process of effective communication. For example, an order you're giving to an employee when he's about to leave the office. He will not be able to listen to that particular order clearly because he's in a hurry to go home. Physical distance is another important barrier. It happens mostly in organizations where the staff is sitting at distant locations, or there are many divisions of the enterprise in different cities. When the receiver of the communication is far away, it becomes difficult for the sender to check whether he has received the message accurately, he has accepted and properly acted upon that communication. Information overload is another physical barrier. Unrestricted flow may result in overloading of information. People getting too much may ignore sometimes something which is very, very essential. Like for example, you get a load of mails. Some even go to spam, which might be a correct mail but has ended up in spam, but you already have checked 10 to 20 mails in a day, so you don't want to check your spam mails now. So that is information overload also creates a barrier to effective communication. Language barriers, or we also call these as semantic barriers. These are the next barriers to communication. Now, the name itself, the title itself suggests that the inability to converse in a language that is not known by both the sender and the receiver is the greatest barrier today. When a person uses inappropriate words while conversing or while writing, it could even lead to misunderstanding between the sender and the receiver. Let me put forward a question. During the COVID-19 lockdown, Prime Minister Narendra Modi always addressed the nation in Hindi language. Why? I'm sure you know the answer, that today in India there are 22 official languages. According to the Article 345 of the Indian Constitution, Hindi is our official language along with English. He opted for Hindi as it is the most understood language in our country. So, we need to understand more deeply the language or the semantic barriers. Variety of meanings. Number one, words seldom mean the same thing to two persons. Language problem occurs when people use the same word in different ways. The second most important, which we really need to clearly understand under semantic barriers, is cultural barrier. Communication in the international environment today becomes even more difficult because of different cultures. The same category of words, phrases, symbols, actions, colors mean different things to people of different countries. Let us understand this with the example of your favorite brand, McDonald's, a multinational company, when it made an entry into India. Language barrier proved to be a major issue for the management, as the communication barrier was of great intensity, especially that between McDonald's and the Indian public. Now, to address this issue of McDonald's, at least 8 languages were used for national launches, decreasing the risk of miscommunication and the inability to connect with the target market, a primary concern from a strategic perspective. On top of the high language barrier, approximately 50% of the nation was considered to be illiterate. The lack of affluence posed another communication issue for the management, which was addressed through high usage of audio, visual and billboards. This would have required McDonald's management to review their strategic planning and develop a marketing plan of a different nature. So we need to understand this categorically from the organization's perspective. Number 3, under language barrier is badly expressed message. Lack of clarity, precision in a message makes it badly expressed. Wrong choice of words, bad organization of ideas, poor sentence structures, poor vocabulary words will lead to vague and poor expressions. Specialist language. Technical language may not be easily understandable by the receiver, and hence it serves as a barrier to communication. Unclarified assumptions, uncommunicated assumptions which underlay practically all messages create also barriers to communication. Now, after understanding all these two, now we have done, just to give you a recap, we have done number 1, physical barriers, where prime importance was given to noise and physical distance, and the second we touched upon was language and semantic barrier, where we touched mainly on the language expressions, we touched upon the cultural barriers, we did an example of MACD, we did an example of COVID-19, and now the third most important barrier that we are going to understand in this particular module is organizational barrier. And you need to give little thought on this. You need to listen to this very carefully, because tomorrow when you're working with the organization, this barrier you need to understand thoroughly. Now, when we work in organizations, there are various rules, policies, hierarchical positions, people who are communicating to us and whom we are communicating to, organizational facilities in abundance around us. Complex organizational structures are there. Go to Google, read about Amazon, your dream company, and then you'll realize that Amazon has got a very deep and complex organizational structure. So, what is the meaning of organizational barrier? Let's go a little deeper into this. The factors internal to the organization which adversely affect the flow of communication are called organizational barriers. Let's pick number 1, organizational policy. If the organizational policy is not supportive to the flow of communication in different directions, you remember different directions? We did upward direction, we did downward direction, we did multi-directional, we did diagonal, right? So those are the meaning of the directions. Communication will not run smoothly. Number 2, organizational rules and regulations. Rules and regulations affect the flow of communication by prescribing the subject matter to the communicated and the channel through which these are to be communicated. Number 3, status differences. Organizations often express hierarchical ranks through a variety of symbols, titles, designations, offices. If the sender has a higher status than that of the receiver, then he has the tendency to not disclose that particular information to the receiver just to maintain his supremacy or the importance in that organization. Some information has come to your boss. He'll try to deprive you of that particular information just because he is your senior. He is senior in your hierarchical levels. Then we go to the next one. Barriers could be also due to organizational structure. And here I would like to quote that you must definitely Google and read the example of Amazon. Amazon, a company which you all wish to work with, dream to work with. Even during COVID-19, Amazon was one company under Jeff Bezos which was working very effectively. But have you ever realized the employees, are they happier? Because organizational structure in this particular company, the complexity of that particular structure is creating a barrier to communication. Organizational facilities, the next one. If the facilities like meetings, complaint boxes, suggestion boxes are not provided in an organization, it will lead to communication failure. The next very important organizational barrier is wrong choice of channel. For example, for the illiterate people. Now, who are the illiterate people in an organization? You'll wonder. The labor class, the workers, the class 4. Written communication cannot be effective. You want to tell them something and you have put the notice on the notice board, and then you expect that they must read that notice board. No. For a sales manager, face-to-face communication is suitable. Wrong media leads to miscommunication even when the message is clearly formed. So I hope you're clear on organizational barriers, which are very crucial in today as well as times to come, because you are going to work in different business enterprises, different business organizations, where you will have to remove these barriers to become successful. Then we move on to the next one, psychological, or it is also called as emotional barriers. Now, quickly looking at psychological, what comes to your mind? Lack of attention, right? Premature evaluation, poor retention, loss by transmission, distrust, emotions, right? There are so many which come to our mind, but we will be doing psychological barriers in detail now. Different persons have different perceptions about reality, which can adversely affect the free flow of communication, and hence these are called perceptual barriers. These are also called as psychological barriers, and there's a third name to them which are called as emotional barriers. So let's start with the number 1 under this, that is called as selective listening. Now suppose I'm lecturing to you, I'm delivering this module to you, and you decide that I am only going to listen to ma'am the first part of what she's saying, and the rest of the time you have your headphones on and you're listening to some songs. So that is called as selective listening. In this form of selective perception, the individual tends to block out new information, especially if it conflicts with existing beliefs. Things that conflict with preconceived emotions are either ignored or distorted to confirm those preconceptions. So this point is clear, I hope so. Premature evaluation. Now, nothing is clear about the exams during the lockdown and even post-COVID lockdown, but there are assumptions that students are making that this is going to happen, exams will not be there, MCQs will be there. You know, we have our own assumptions. We've not listened to what is actually the sender saying, and we are doing premature evaluation, understanding the problems, situations, ideas before you take your decision or do evaluation. Number 3, psychological and emotional barrier is another block in communication. They are stronger than physical barrier because the message cannot penetrate easily into the person if they have blocked their mind. So this barrier becomes very crucial. The next one is emotional attitude. If the superior has a tendency to lose his temper every time you go to your head, or you go to the superior in an organization, he starts shouting at you, he starts insulting you in front of your colleagues, you will develop a fear to speak. So that is called as emotional attitude. That also creates a barrier to communication, because every time you now go to speak to that particular person, you will think twice. Inferring, that's another psychological or perceptual or emotional barrier. Direct seeing, hearing, feeling, tasting, smelling, these can be verified and hence constitute a fact. For example, when I send a mail, I assume that it will be received and it will be read by the receiver. I never want to even check whether that mail has been received. So what do I do if I want that particular mail has been received? I'll write in the end, kindly acknowledge when received. So that is the time when the receiver will send me a thanks or will send me a confirmation mail. So with this, we understand what are the psychological barriers. I hope you are not doing selective listening. We started with the barriers, and in that number 1 was physical barriers, right? Number 2, we did the language barriers. Number 3, we touched upon the organizational barriers, then we went on to do psychological or emotional barriers, and now we will be touching upon the 5th one, that is the personal barriers, right? Now, barriers due to resistance to change. Most people do not want to change their routines as they fear that their authorities and responsibilities would be affected due to such a change. For example, today during the lockdown, most of the people or most of the organizations have asked their employees to work from home. It is a kind of a big sea change for the employees that they do not have to work between 9 to 5, but they are not even comfortable doing this. So, this is again a barrier to communication, resistivity to change, lack of trust and confidence. Number 2, if the management and the workers are not having good relations, there is a lack between both of them, then communication cannot flow freely in the organization. Hence, when the source of the information is not trustworthy, then the communication will be rejected by the receiver. And who are the receiver in this particular case? The employees. And here the receiver is you, my students. Number 3, lack of ability to communicate by the superior. Number 4, inattention. Many a times the receiver of the message may not be interested in the message which the sender wants to communicate. For example, many people, they've generally gone for a stroll, or they've gone to some other department, they skip over these reports, the circulars, the bulletin boards, as well as the notice boards. Another barrier is the difference in the speed of talking and listening. The speed at which I am speaking and the speed at which you are listening. Speakers speak at a rate of flow 120 to 160 words per minute, whereas the listener can process 4 times faster. So there is always a difference. So that is the time which you get to procrastinate, whether you are in a class or whether you are in an office situation. So these are the 5 important essential barriers to communication which we need to understand so that our communication from the sender to the receiver is effective. Now we will be doing how to overcome these barriers. That's the most important thing. Shortening the line of communication, creating direct contact between the communicator and the communicatee, using simple language to get over the language barrier, developing patience to listen and understand others, and avoiding selective listening. Keep it short and simple. Utilize feedback. Feedback, I told you about suggestion boxes. Develop mutual trust between whom? The management as well as the workers. More use of informal and face-to-face talks. There's another communication audit which also can take place in the organizations. The format of the audit may include observations, questionnaires, interviews and analysis of written documents. To avoid premature evaluation before listening to the entire message, to give due importance to the gestures and tones. Coordination is another important thing to overcome these barriers. Communication to express and not to impress the receiver. To have a personal touch in the communication. So with this, I hope you all have got the gist of this particular topic and you have understood why we must try to remove these barriers to communication so that working in the organizations becomes much more effective. Now, before we end this module, let us look at a few important questions. What is communication? What are the various barriers to communication? How can these barriers be removed? This can be a long type question that you can get in your exams. What are the physical barriers in the communication process? How do they differ from organizational barriers? Explain. Again, a long type question. Short type questions could be explain language barriers, give any 4 barriers to communication, and many more such short type as well as multiple choice questions. I have given you some suggested readings There are lots of books on barriers to communication. In case you cannot get these from your college libraries, since the colleges are closed, you can even download free books, free PDFs on internet, which you can do for self-reading and deeper understanding of this particular topic. We'll get connected again in our next module on Unit 4 of this very relevant subject, business organization and communication. Till then, keep reading. Thank you.